Now it's time for Anita to introduce our speaker, Matthew Sasaki.
I'm happy to introduce him. So Matt is our speaker today. He's a recent PhD from UConn School of Oceanography. He did his master's at the Scrip Institute of Oceanography. He also did his undergraduate work at UC San Diego. His focus is on the study of copepods, which is a type of zooplankton. So with no further introductions, I'm going to hand this over to Dr. Matthew Sasaki.
Thank you, Anita, for that introduction. I'm really excited to be able to talk with you all tonight. I don't want to give too much away, but I really dislike the biological species concept. So let's dive in. This is where I'm going to try to convince you that species don't actually exist. We're now going to break this down a little bit and talk about whether or not we actually think species exist. Now, I am being a little bit facetious, right? Of course, species exist sometimes, but I definitely think that the way we use the species concept to describe diversity is reckless and is vulnerable to sort of exceptions. So there are two main arguments that I'm going to make in this section. The first one is based on definitions. Like I said, I really don't like the biological species concept because it is really centered around large, charismatic vertebrate taxa, vertebrate organisms, which is an issue because the vast majority of life isn't like that, right? If you remember, the biological species concept defines species based on their ability or inability to create viable offspring through sexual reproduction. The vast majority of life does not reproduce sexually. If you think about plants, a lot of plants are able to self-fertilize or produce viable seeds without the need of fertilization at all. Yeast, for example, one of the most important microorganisms for the development of humanity, human societies, doesn't require sexual reproduction. There are incredibly diverse forms of single-celled life, like these ciliates, right, which are important in marine and terrestrial ecosystems, don't require sexual reproduction. Bacteria don't require sexual reproduction. And the issue this poses is that this completely breaks down the biological species concept because we need a good way to define diversity in these groups that don't require sexual reproduction. And so to put this into perspective a little bit, this is a relatively new representation of the tree of life, right? All living things. What I want to point out is this group, Opisthecons. This grouping contains all animal life and all fungi. All animals, all fungus are in Opisthecons. That's this one little branch right there. Everything else in this tree does not require sexual reproduction. And so when we're looking at how do we define species, what's the definition we're going to use for species, the definition that we use right now applies to this single branch of the tree of life. And now we're supposed to be using this definition, the biological species concept, to describe diversity across the rest of the tree. That's a major issue I have with this. The other issue I have is that the biological species concept doesn't even apply to all vertebrates, which is the group it was designed to work for. So there are lots of examples where we call things different species, even though they can reproduce and produce viable offspring with each other. There are also really interesting examples, though, where we call things different species, even though these vertebrates don't require sexual reproduction, right? So this is a process called parthenogenesis, but parthenogenesis is a process by which female organisms can produce offspring without being fertilized by a male. For example, this is a whiptail lizard from New Mexico. Every representative, every individual of the species is female. There are no male New Mexico whiptail lizards because females produce offspring without being fertilized. We've seen the same thing in Komodo dragons, right? This mysterious phenomenon where there were a couple Komodo dragons in zoos a couple of years ago, where all of a sudden they were producing eggs that hatched when they had never been in contact with a male. It's surprising that zookeepers all of a sudden have multiple Komodo dragons in an exhibit where there's only supposed to be one or two. There's a line of domesticated turkeys that produces parthenogenic offspring, right, where you don't need to fertilize the turkeys. Fish, sharks, this phenomenon of parthenogenesis is actually becoming increasingly common, right? The harder we look for parthenogenic organisms, the more we find. Again, the biological species concept falls apart when you have species like this. And so when we look at the diversity of organisms that aren't described by the biological species concept, from bacteria to plants, microbes, and all the way up to vertebrates, I think we have to ask ourselves, how can we use species as our primary unit for describing diversity if we can't reliably define what a species is? So my first argument is maybe not that species don't exist, it's that we don't have a good definition for what species are yet. If someone can come up with a good definition for what a species is, I am all for using it to describe diversity. But I think that as of now, the current definition we use is inappropriate. Now, the other issue that I have with using species and the Linnaean taxonomy to describe diversity is that I think it misses the point. It's focusing on the wrong things. And so for this section, we're going to talk about how evolutionary change is continuous. Evolution itself is a continuous process. It is always creating diversity. And what we end up with is a continuous spectrum of diversity. The Linnaean taxonomy is not designed to reflect this. And so I'm going to illustrate where the Linnaean taxonomy works and where it doesn't work using a schematic. We'll see how this works. So the traditional thinking about how evolution creates species is that sort of at one point you have this ancestor species, and then over lots and lots of time, this splits and evolution will create two different descendant species. The trick is that this takes a lot of time, sort of on evolutionary timescales. The Linnaean taxonomy does really well with this situation. The Linnaean taxonomy and sort of the methods that we have in most cases can look at these and say, okay, these are two different species, they share a common ancestor, and so they'll fit together more closely in the Linnaean taxonomy than species that don't share a common ancestor with. I think, sort of as an evolutionary biologist, I don't really care what this looks like up here. What I want to know, and what I want our system of describing diversity to account for, is what happens here. What creates that split between a single ancestor species into multiple descendant species? And this is where the Linnaean taxonomy doesn't do great. And so again, if we imagine we have sort of a population, a group of this, or one of our descendant species, our green circle species, and they live in this pond or on this island, right? We'll say they live on this island, and they're isolated on this island. They've lived there for a long time. Something happens, a big wave comes through, a storm happens, and it blows some individuals from this island to adjacent islands, right? So they get moved aside, but it's a one-time thing. And now we have three groups of the same species. Evolution over relatively short timescales can create small differences, whether this is random chance that's doing this, or if this is natural selection, creating, fine-tuning the way organisms act or behave to their specific environments. It might happen again, right? We can imagine this happens every once in a while. We get this repeated process of dispersal and then isolation and the accumulation of small differences. This process, this diversity that we are now looking at, can also be accounted for in a phylogeny, sort of like we said earlier, these branching points where populations get split and isolated around. This diversity is incredibly important to account for. This is the seeds for deeper splits that we get when we're looking at sort of how species form over really long time scales. This diversity can be adaptive, so that can be important for understanding how species or populations are going to respond to things like climate change or to anthropogenic influence. This is where the Linnaean taxonomy doesn't do a great job, right? Once you have variation within a species, there's really no good way to account for this in the Linnaean taxonomy without starting to designate increasingly specific sublevels, so subspecies, but you will always end up with this issue until you are assigning individuals identification. The Linnaean taxonomy will always obscure some level of diversity. So this is the other main issue that I have with the Linnaean taxonomy, that evolution is a continuous process, and that continuous spectrum of diversity that it's creating is really important to account for. However, the Linnaean taxonomy likes to put things in boxes, and those boxes will always obscure some level of diversity, and it risks obscuring the processes themselves that generate diversity. So if we go back to the goal of systematics, the goal of classification, the whole reason we're describing species in the first place is that we want to understand the diversity in the world around us. I would counter that understanding that diversity is fine and interesting, but what we really need to be doing is working on a system that understands not only the diversity, but the processes that generate the diversity that we see. The question then becomes, hopefully the arguments that I've been making are starting to convince you, yeah, maybe species is outdated or inefficient at times. And so the question then becomes, why is species still something that we all use? The short answer is we don't have a good alternative yet. If you remember, our first sort of concept of how to organize diversity goes back to Aristotle, 2000 plus years ago. That's a lot of history. That's a lot of effort. That's a lot of progress that sort of ecology and evolutionary biology has made in understanding the diversity of life. A new system needs to not erase that, but rather build upon it, right? Reframe that diversity. And there's not a perfect system yet that does that.
Matt, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. This was fantastic. I'm so excited to be able to do this. I had a lot of fun.